Today we're going to take a look at the function and dysfunction of leptin. I'll see you inside. So in this episode, we'll talk about how the body will actually naturally regulate our body weight and try and maintain what's referred to as the body fat set point. And the easiest way to think of the body fat set point is that this is the comfortable level of body fat that your mind and body prefer to be at. When you exceed the body fat set point, there are mechanisms to decrease your appetite and try and get you to lose weight until you return to your body fat set point. And on the other side, when you begin to lose too much weight, you will have an increase in hunger, which will drive you to eat more and return to your body weight set point. Unfortunately, we can't choose this set point, but you may have a fairly good idea of where this set point is at simply by looking at the times that you were eating to appetite. What was the normal weight that you typically held? With that being said, the food that we have available to us is kind of giving this body weight set point a run for its money. And what I mean by this is that almost anyone would be able to maintain a lean, healthy physique simply by eating to appetite if they were mainly eating foods that were unprocessed and simply foods that we've had throughout most of human evolution. With that being said, when we begin to throw processed foods into the mix, most people are unable to regulate their appetite to maintain a healthy physique. And there's a myriad of reasons for this, but most of them are because of the hedonic aspect of these foods. And a hedonic behavior is simply an action that fulfills a personal desire. And as we'll discuss in a moment, excessive body fat can actually dysregulate this body fat thermostat. And we eventually still feel hungry despite gaining excessive body weight. So in terms of regulating our body weight, I think the best term that I've found is called the lipostat. And the lipostat is simply how the body detects and responds to an increase or decrease in body weight. And just like a thermostat, the lipostat will help maintain your body weight at whatever our body weight set point is. And the way it does this is by increasing our metabolism and lowering our appetite unconsciously if we gain too much weight. And if we lose too much weight, we will actually inhibit the signaling of appetite suppression and an increased metabolism. And the way that the body does this is through a hormone called leptin. While there are many hormones that work to increase or decrease metabolism and increase or decrease our appetite, leptin is the only one that really seems to be controlled by our body fat. And the reason I say this is because leptin is actually produced by our fat cells. And the fat cells will continuously produce leptin in a pulsatile circadian pattern throughout the entire day. What I mean is that at different times of the day we'll be producing more or less leptin. For example, leptin production will be inhibited prior to a meal in order to increase our appetite. And the production of leptin will increase after a meal and during the night to keep us from continuing to seek food. And now we can actually regulate our own leptin circadian pattern simply by changing our meal timing. If you don't typically eat in the morning, you'll have higher levels of leptin. But if you wake up first thing in the morning and always have breakfast, your leptin will be suppressed, so you will continue to feel hungry for breakfast. And really the only thing that's different between lean people and overweight people in terms of leptin production is the amount of leptin that's produced during each pulse. In almost all scenarios, the more fat cells you have, the more leptin you will produce. Additionally, as you begin to gain weight, you will begin to produce more leptin, and when you begin to lose weight, you'll begin to produce less leptin. The best way to think about it is think of your fat cells as sending a message to your brain. If you only have 100 fat cells, you'll only be able to send 100 messages. But if you have 1,000 fat cells, you'll be able to send 1,000 messages. So leptin is actually stored and produced inside of the fat cells, and it is released in the circadian pattern. However, other hormones and neurotransmitters can actually upregulate or downregulate the production of leptin. And the reason for this is because some hormones and neurotransmitters can increase the transcription of the gene that codes for the production of leptin, and other hormones and neurotransmitters can actually inhibit it. There are also a few other things that can upregulate or downregulate its transcription, but we'll get into that in a moment. I think to better conceptualize this, we'll actually talk about what leptin actually does first, because knowing what leptin actually does helps us kind of make sense as to why certain hormones and neurotransmitters have the effect on leptin that they do. So leptin, once again, is a hormone and it will bind to the leptin receptor. And this receptor is located on a bunch of different cell types. And it seems like they're finding more and more leptin receptors every single day. And this receptor sits on the membrane of the cell, and leptin doesn't actually even go into the cell. But when it binds to its receptor, a bunch of different intracellular processes occur. And the end result is the upregulation of specific transcription factors. And these are just proteins inside the cell that, when they're activated, will bind to the DNA and increase the production of certain proteins. And there are actually a lot of different molecules that are transcribed, and it's different between different cell types. But the net result of these proteins is to increase metabolism and decrease our hunger. Some of these proteins are actually hormones that will reduce our appetite. And other proteins are enzymes and organelles that are important for our metabolism. So the best place to start off would actually be in the brain. And I think a good way to think about our brain is that the brain has a natural tendency to try and conserve as much energy as possible and increase our appetite as much as we can to find food. So the process of increasing our metabolism and decreasing our appetite is actually a fairly energy intensive process of trying to increase the cell's metabolic rate and produce specific hormones and neurotransmitters that deter us from trying to find more food. But remember, leptin is actually produced by the fat cells, meaning that leptin will be released into the bloodstream. And the only way for leptin to actually get into the brain is to cross what's referred to as the blood-brain barrier. And this is a lining of cells that keep things from our bloodstream from actually getting into the brain, and it has selective channels or receptors to allow certain molecules into the brain. And on the side of the cells that actually faces the bloodstream, there is a leptin receptor that leptin will bind to. And this receptor will actually take leptin inside of the cell and release it out of the other side of the cell. And this is the side of the membrane that the brain is in. So then leptin is able to bind to different receptors inside of the brain. So the leptin receptors are going to be located primarily on the neurons inside of the brain. And there are a lot of different neurons, but these neurons are typically referred to as anorexigenic neurons, which means that when they are stimulated, it will cause a reduction in appetite and feeding behavior. So once again, leptin will bind to the neuron and cause the transcription of specific proteins, hormones, and neurotransmitters. One specific molecule is called POMC, and this is an acronym for pro-opiomelanocortin, which I did an entire episode, which would be episode number 42, called Tanning Addiction, the Biology of Tanning, and a whole lot more. And what you'll find out in that episode is that this POMC molecule is cleaved up into different types of molecules. And one of the most important ones is a molecule called melanocyte-stimulating hormone. And this hormone has a bunch of downstream effects to reduce our appetite. But the other really interesting thing is that through the production of melanocyte-stimulating hormone, one of the byproducts is a molecule called beta-endorphin, which is our body's natural opioid. So this will cause feelings of reward and a decreased pain perception. And both of these sensations tend to decrease our desire to eat. The other molecule that will be produced in abundance is a molecule called CART or CART. And this is an acronym, and what it stands for is quite interesting. It stands for Cocaine and Amphetamine Regulated Transcript. And given its name and what we've discussed so far, you may be able to imagine what this CART protein does. This transcript actually mediates some of the functions of cocaine and amphetamine, specifically their downstream ability to suppress our appetite. And one of the biggest ways it does this is actually by inhibiting some of the other peptides and hormones that will increase our hunger, specifically peptides called neuropeptide Y and AGRP. And leptin can actually alter the functioning of other neurotransmitters you may be more familiar with. One of the most interesting one is its effect on dopamine. Leptin will actually increase the dopamine signaling within the brain. And episode 8 was a very in-depth discussion about dopamine. But the main takeaway is that dopamine will mediate what we will and will not put effort into. If you have higher levels of dopamine at baseline, you are more motivated to seek external rewards. And now one might think that dopamine may actually increase our hunger and increase feeding behaviors. And this would be because the thought of hyperpalatable foods will also increase dopamine levels, which would motivate us to go find and consume these foods. However, the thing is that dopamine will modulate our motivation for everything. An upregulation in dopamine production simply makes it more likely we will engage in some sort of goal-oriented behavior. However, given all of the other signals that are suppressing our appetite and making food seem less appealing, the reward value of food will have decreased. Therefore, we will center this upregulation of motivation caused by dopamine towards other behaviors. And if you really want to think about it, this increase in dopamine caused by leptin could actually motivate us to exercise or work because we are no longer focused on food. And I actually want to take a brief moment to maybe describe why this would make sense. Once again, leptin is signaling to the brain that we have energy available. And the more energy we have available, the more leptin will be produced. Dopamine will increase our motivation and movement. And it would make sense that the signal of energy availability would modulate our likelihood to actually put in effort. The more leptin, the more dopamine we'll have, and the more likely we will be to expend energy. And now the other two neurotransmitters I want to talk about are serotonin and GABA. Higher serotonin levels will increase our satiety. And this is really because serotonin plays a role in making us feel content with our current state of being. To better see serotonin's role, we can look at someone with pathologically high levels of serotonin. These individuals find themselves content with simply sitting on the couch all day and doing nothing. Serotonin really does the opposite of dopamine, and high serotonin levels will inhibit goal-oriented behaviors. And this will decrease our feelings of need for food. And now the other hormone is GABA, and GABA is called the inhibitory neurotransmitter. And this GABA production is really centered around regions of the brain that would typically increase our hunger, and GABA's inhibitory effects makes it such that we don't have these hunger-promoting signals being sent. And while there are other minor effects of leptin inside the brain, and it really does seem like they're finding more and more every single day, the majority, if not all, of leptin's effects on the brain are to decrease our appetite. And the increase in metabolic expenditure will typically be through leptin's actions on other tissues in the body and not in the brain. The first one I want to talk about is actually on the fat cell itself. So I said that leptin is produced by fat cells, but it can also act on the fat cell. And just like in the brain, it will increase the activity of transcription factors that will bind to the DNA and cause the upregulation in the production of specific proteins. And on the fat cells, it will increase the production of enzymes that actually help facilitate the use of stored fatty acids. So enzymes and other cofactors required for the entire process of breaking down these stored triglycerides into fatty acids and glycerol, and using these fatty acids to create energy. One of the other functions is to actually inhibit a specific enzyme on the fat tissue called lipoprotein lipase, which is an enzyme that actually binds to lipoproteins such as VLDL in the bloodstream and will actually break down these stored triglycerides so that it can uptake more fatty acids into the cell. But what leptin does is actually produce different proteins that can inhibit this enzyme. And the benefit of this is that the cells will no longer take more energy on board and instead resort to using what they already have stored for energy. And once again, in the grand scheme of things, this makes sense. As leptin is produced when our fat cells increase in quantity and size, a very smart effect of leptin would be to cause the fat cells to use that additional energy that they have stored and try and prevent from further fat storage. And there are also leptin receptors on the liver, and these receptors will increase the production of proteins and enzymes that are important for the breakdown of fat and release of fatty acids into the bloodstream from the storage sites in the liver. And this is actually why leptin has been proposed to be a very useful tool for something called fatty liver disease. And this is when there's actually fat that accumulates inside of the liver. And the action of leptin is to increase the enzymes that will break down this fat and release these fatty acids into the bloodstream. And similar to the muscle, it will inhibit the storage of more triglycerides. And similar to the adipose tissue and the liver, leptin will actually increase the fuel utilization at the muscle cell. However, it does this a little bit differently. So the energy expenditure of a muscle cell is mostly mediated by the energy that it uptakes from the bloodstream. So at the fat cell and at the liver cell, leptin's function is to actually liberate the stored energy. But since the muscle cells don't have that great of a store, at the muscle cell, leptin's function is to actually take advantage of the increased energy availability by increasing the nutrient uptake from the bloodstream into the muscle cell, and also increase all of the enzymes required for utilizing this energy. So it'll increase the expression of glucose and amino acid transporters to allow more of these transporters to bind to the membrane and allow these molecules into the cell. Some of the other things it will increase are the enzymes required for protein synthesis and glycogen replenishment. And now a lot of these actions actually appear to be because leptin has a downstream effect on the insulin receptor and can increase the sensitivity of these receptors, which means the muscle cells will be better able to take up fuel. And I'll talk about the interplay between insulin and leptin in a moment. But before we do that, I actually want to talk about where else leptin can be produced. You see, it isn't just the fat cells that will produce leptin. Leptin is mainly produced in the fat cells, but there are actually other types of cells that have the ability to produce leptin. Leptin can actually be produced by the immune cells. And oftentimes, the leptin produced by an immune cell will bind to the leptin receptor on a neighboring immune cell. And to try and simplify a very complex series of reactions, leptin will really work to increase our inflammatory response. And it does this by increasing the proteins involved in what's called cell differentiation. So a lot of white blood cells are actually dormant and don't have a function. But leptin will upregulate the proteins involved in turning these dormant cells into active immune cells. And these specific genes correlated to leptin are the production of proteins that are pro-inflammatory. For example, the production of T cells, natural killer cells, and inflammatory macrophages. Leptin really works to increase our inflammatory activity. And now you could make a reason for why this would be beneficial, as the food that we eat is loaded in bacteria. You may not have known this, but everything that you put in your mouth has loads of bacteria on it. But your body does an extremely good job of simply killing off this bacteria. However, just in case, it would be helpful to have an increased inflammatory immune system that can work to kill off any residual bacteria that comes in with the food that we eat. Which leads me directly into my next topic, which is the fact that we will produce leptin after we've eaten a meal. So leptin will typically decrease prior to a meal to cause us to feel hungry, and then leptin production will increase in response to ingesting food. And it actually has a fairly interesting mechanism, because not only is it released by fat cells, but there are also cells inside of our intestines that can release leptin. So we have what are called gastric secretions, which are fluids that are produced that will help us to digest our food. This fluid contains enzymes responsible for breaking down the different macro and micronutrients and absorbing them. And inside of this fluid is actually leptin. And once again, there's definitely some logic behind this, because the type and quantity of nutrients regulates our production of these gastric juices, which means the more food that we've eaten, the more leptin we'll likely produce. And this can have all of its effects on promoting insulin sensitivity, decreasing appetite, increasing the muscle's likelihood to uptake these nutrients, increasing the other cell's energy expenditure to make room for these nutrients, and putting our immune system in the best state to neutralize any bacteria or pathogens. And the very last effect of leptin that I want to talk about is what's called the browning of body fat. And I do hope to do an entire episode about this in the future, but people have begun to delineate fat cell types. So fat cells lie on a spectrum between white and brown. And the closer to brown a fat cell is, the higher its metabolic expenditure. So in comparison to brown fat, white fat has a low metabolic expenditure and does not produce much heat. But brown fat actually has more mitochondria, and interestingly, they have a protein inside of their mitochondria called UCP1, and its full name is uncoupling protein 1. And what it does is, through the process of actually creating energy, it will simply just let off heat. For lack of a better term for it, it will literally waste energy. And this wasted energy comes in the form of the production of heat. And now what's really interesting about this is that babies have an extremely high level of brown fat because they don't really have the ability to shiver. So this brown fat helps keep them warm. And this is just one of many reasons that for their body size, babies actually have a fairly high metabolic rate. And what leptin does is it binds to its receptor on the fat cell and increases the production of all the proteins that are involved in the browning of body fat and increasing the metabolic expenditure of the fat cell. And now these are really the big effector organs and the big effects of leptin. There are some slightly smaller effects that there really is not much scientific literature on to make definite conclusions. So what I want to talk about next is actually the influence of other hormones and neurotransmitters on the production and transcription of the leptin gene. So really the best way to think about it is that any sort of neurotransmitter or hormone that signals to the body that we have an abundance of energy will increase the production of leptin. And in the same way that leptin works to increase transcription factor activity, some hormones and neurotransmitters can increase the activity of the transcription factor for the leptin gene. And the major one is going to be insulin, growth hormone, and IGF-1. And as we know, insulin is actually produced in response to a meal. This will help facilitate nutrient uptake. And growth hormone and IGF-1 have similar effects on increasing nutrient uptake and increasing anabolism, which is simply just the growth of a cell. Now, interestingly, I mentioned earlier that leptin can actually increase the sensitivity of the insulin receptor. So insulin and leptin really work in tandem, which will actually be important in a moment when we talk about dysfunctional leptin signaling and how it could possibly be correlated with what's referred to as insulin resistance. But the first thing I actually wanted to talk about was growth hormone. So I told you that leptin production will increase overnight, and this is in order to decrease our appetite during the night. And what's very interesting is that while we sleep, we have some of the largest increases in growth hormone. And I really don't think there's been many studies on the interrelationship between growth hormone and leptin. However, it certainly is an interesting concept that the production of growth hormone will increase leptin, which unfortunately for us means that if we don't get this pulse of growth hormone while we sleep, which would occur in a scenario in which we either get poor sleep or do not get sleep, then we won't have an increase in leptin and we will have a stronger appetite the following day, which I think the majority of people who have ever had a poor night of sleep can relate to. And once again, there's a series of different mechanisms that occur to increase our appetite after a poor night of sleep. Additionally, a poor night of sleep has been shown to decrease our insulin sensitivity, which once again could be mediated by leptin. Well, not necessarily entirely mediated by leptin, but leptin certainly could contribute to the reduced insulin sensitivity and the increased appetite. So if you know any scientists, I definitely want to pitch this idea to them and see if we could run a few trials, because I find this to be a fairly intriguing explanation of the increased appetite and decreased insulin sensitivity that follow a poor night of sleep. So the other hormone I wanted to mention was actually cortisol. I think that a lot of people actually have a misconception of cortisol. We think that cortisol is bad because it's correlated with stress. But the thing is that cortisol is actually what aids us in coping with stress. You see, they've done some interesting studies where they put two groups and give them the same external stressor. but one group is actually injected with cortisol and the other is the control group. And the groups injected with cortisol report lower sensations and feelings of stress. The cortisol allowed them to better cope with this stress. And one of the ways that it actually does this is by increasing energy availability by going into our stored tissues and liberating energy, such as stored triglycerides and stored glycogen. And leptin has this same function. So cortisol will actually bind to the fat cells and increase the production of leptin, and possibly also the immune cells, and uses leptin to enhance its function. And now the last hormone that I want to talk about is the thyroid hormone. Leptin and thyroid have an interesting relationship. So leptin will increase the production of thyroid hormone, which certainly makes sense because the thyroid hormone is involved in increasing the energy expenditure of a cell. Simply, it will just increase the metabolism of just about any cell that it binds to. And this will lead me into my next topic. But when the body actually develops what's referred to as leptin resistance, then we could have extremely high levels of body fat, but because there is so much leptin around, we become resistant to leptin, meaning that someone who is overweight may actually have a decrease in their thyroid, which could cause a vicious cycle of having a very high appetite, increasing our body mass, and decreasing our metabolism through a series of different mechanisms. So that being said, I want to talk about leptin resistance. So at normal levels of leptin, the body doesn't really make any adaptations to increase or decrease its sensitivity to leptin. It does make some very slight and subtle changes, but for the most part, nothing crazy happens. However, when we begin to accumulate a large amount of body fat and overeat for a prolonged period of time, we will begin to constantly produce a lot of leptin. Simply, if we never get in a state of energy deficiency and we are always consuming food, we will always have both high production of leptin and we will never have any sort of subsequent downregulation of leptin in response to low food availability or weight loss. And what happens is a phenomenon called leptin resistance that's very similar to insulin resistance. This is the body's way of actually responding to having high circulating levels of a given hormone or neurotransmitter. In order for these molecules to work, it actually has to bind to a receptor. And not only can we make these receptors dysfunctional, but we can simply reduce the amount of receptors available. And this appears to mediate leptin resistance. One of the big things is that we have less leptin receptors, and these receptors are not as sensitive to the circulating leptin, which means in order to send the same signal, we need to produce far more leptin. And the problem with this is that the only way to increase our leptin production is by eating and increasing our body mass. But this causes a vicious cycle because the more leptin we have circulating, the worse this leptin resistance will get. So even though we have accumulated a lot of body fat, we may still have a low metabolism and a high appetite. And one of the ways this actually occurs is through this blood-brain barrier that I mentioned earlier. So leptin receptors can become insensitive and reduce in number all around the body, but specifically on the blood-brain barrier. When the leptin receptors reduce, no leptin can be transported into the brain. So we get kind of an accumulation of leptin within the bloodstream, but this leptin simply isn't binding to the receptor. And now another contributor to this could actually be high levels of cortisol, because as I mentioned, cortisol will increase the amount of leptin we produce. Similarly, because overeating typically comes in tandem with high insulin levels, the increased production of insulin will also work to increase our production of leptin and contribute to this leptin resistance. And again, leptin is just one molecule in a sea of many molecules. However, we certainly do see this phenotype in some overweight individuals. Despite being fairly overweight, they may have a low thyroid, have a high appetite, and have difficulties with insulin resistance. Or a better word for insulin resistance would be insulin insensitivity. Oftentimes, they also develop what's referred to as insulin-resistant sarcopenia. It can also be termed as anabolic resistant, because when you begin to become insulin resistant, and likely also contributing is leptin resistant, you are unable to increase the protein synthesis and nutrient uptake processes at the level of the muscle that are mediated by both leptin and insulin. Okay, with that out of the way, let's talk about what we can do. So obviously the best thing you can do is not allow this to occur in the first place. But let's say this is occurring, there's actually some things we could try to help restore our leptin sensitivity. So it seems that exercise, fasting, and fasted exercise actually increase both insulin sensitivity and leptin sensitivity. Simply putting the body in a state of energy deficiency for some prolonged period of time will reduce circulating leptin. And one very interesting quirk about the body is that when there is a specific hormone or neurotransmitter that isn't very abundant, the body will actually increase the sensitivity of the receptors by increasing the receptor sensitivity itself and increasing the number of receptors available. And you've likely found this in your own life. Let's say you've tried one of those dopamine fasts before where you try and stop any sort of dopamine stimulating behavior. The first time you return to something that will increase your dopamine levels, like food or the internet, you feel much more sensitive to all of the motivating and rewarding aspects of dopamine. We can try and get the same effect from leptin simply by taking periods of time in which we have low circulating leptin. And really the only way we can do this is having an energy deficit for some period of time. And like I said, we can do this through fasting, we can do this through weight loss, and we can also do this through exercise. And I think the biggest benefit to someone who is overweight who does these is that they will still have more leptin production. So let's say someone who is overweight has the same leptin sensitivity to someone who is lean. Because they simply produce more leptin, they will have a far greater signaling of leptin than someone who is just producing less leptin. The only problem is that when you get too overweight, you don't have this sensitivity. But if you can restore this sensitivity, you will have profound effects on reducing your appetite and increasing your metabolism. And now remember that a lot of times this is actually very genetically driven. Some people simply don't have the ability to overeat, it seems like. Every time they begin gaining any sort of weight, their appetite gets in the way. However, it does appear that after excessive weight gain, you actually change your body fat set point to being higher. And this is because you have reduced leptin sensitivity and need more leptin production to send the same signal. And like I said, the only way to have more circulating leptin is to have more body fat. And I think the final thing I'll leave you on is that really the best way that humans are able to regulate their appetite is by eating foods that we've had throughout the entire or the majority of our evolution. And so often people overcomplicate it, but really think to yourself about what foods grow naturally on Earth. Any food that has one ingredient and requires carbon dioxide and oxygen to live is a food that the body will likely have a very easy time regulating your appetite to maintain a healthy body weight. And there weren't really many definitive papers on the exact interaction between nutrients and leptin. But from what I gathered, eating foods that help you maintain insulin sensitivity, like dietary fats and protein, and maybe not extremely dense carbohydrates like a soda or candy, but instead things like potatoes, fruits, and vegetables don't really seem to contribute to this leptin or insulin, for that matter, resistance phenomenon. So once again, I think everyone knows what real food is and everyone knows what fake food is. And simply just doing your very best to always choose real food. When you go to the grocery store, pick out all the fruits and vegetables in the produce section that you want. And then maybe go to the frozen section and find any fruit and vegetable that they have there. And the same thing with the canned section. Go to the canned section and find the fruits and vegetables. And if you want, while you're there, find some canned fish or canned meat in water. Technically, there's more than one ingredient, but it's just meat and water. And then go to the meat section and pick up any sort of fresh meat that simply has one ingredient. And don't forget to stop by the egg section and grab some eggs for all of the nutrients that they provide. And if you really want to get fancy with it, go to the spice section and pick up all the herbs and spices that have one ingredient that you can find. And don't forget to pick up some salt while you're there. And with all these foods, the body will be able to regulate its appetite so we don't gain excessive body fat and don't gain so much body fat that we begin to get insulin and leptin resistant. With that being said, if you have any questions or you may want a little bit more help, please feel free to reach out to me either on Instagram at Calvin_Scheller or at one of the links in the bio that I will attach in the description of this episode. With that being said, I hope you enjoyed and I hope you learned something new. Thank you for listening and have a great day.